In today's video, I'm going to be covering more awesome cards from Secrets of Strixhaven Preview Season, focusing on commons, which are absolutely essential if you want to do well at your pre-release and in your drafts, because most of the cards in your deck are going to be commons. And so if you're just focused on the high rarity cards and don't understand which cards are good at low rarities, you're going to end up with really kind of mediocre decks that don't actually fully maximize your cards. So let's dive in. First up is Bogwater Lumaret. It's black-green for a 2/2 Spirit Frog. Whenever this creature or another creature you control enters, you gain 1 life. Now, the first thing to understand about this card is that it just has a solid rate. 2 mana 2/2 is what you're looking for in draft, even though the fact that it's both colors does mean that that will sometimes make it harder for you to cast it on turn 2, though most of the time you are going to keep a hand that has access to both of your colors in limited games. Now, the thing to understand about this card is that it's very format dependent. In a lot of formats, this would be a solid card just because a 2/2 that gains you a life and gains you life over the course of the game is a solid card. But in this format, this is an absolutely crucial synergy enabler for the black-green decks. And so overall, this is a card you're really actively looking for in your black-green decks because it's going to set up so much of what you want to do. For example, if you combine it with Pest Mascot, this is one of the best curve-out starts you can have for your black-green decks. Pest Mascot is 1 black-green for a 2/3 Pest Ape. It has Trample, and whenever you gain life, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. So if you curve that 2-drop into your Pest Mascot, the Pest Mascot enters, you'll gain a life. It'll immediately become a 3/4. Any future creatures you play, you gain a life. This creature continues to grow. So as you can see, having that 2-drop synergy enabler can set up the rest of your cards. Pest Mascot isn't a card that you generally want to play unless you can consistently gain life, because a 3 mana 2/3 Trampler isn't that good. Even a 3 mana 2/3 Trampler that at some point in the late game becomes a 3/4 isn't that great either. You want to have the ability to consistently grow this over the course of the game so your opponent feels compelled to answer it. So in Sealed, if you're looking at your commons and you're like, okay, Pest Mascot, I'm playing black-green, I want to play all of the black-green cards I have, make sure you carefully analyze whether or not you actually have the life gain support to make Pest Mascot a good card, because there are plenty of black-green cards that can gain you incremental life. It's part of the synergy of the archetype. And understanding when you want the Pest Mascot versus not is going to make your decks a lot better, because there are going to be some black-green decks, especially in Sealed, where maybe you don't get the life gain enablers. Then you want to leave your Pest Mascot on the sidelines and focus less on synergy and more on just raw like card power level and just having like a macro plan, like playing a grindy mid-range deck. And there are going to be some decks where you have a couple of those 2-drops that gain you life, and Pest Mascot becomes an absolutely like really nice card that you're happy to play. And so make sure that, especially in Sealed, when you don't have as much control over building around synergy, you identify whether or not you have enough life gain to actually make these cards work, and don't just throw them into your deck because they match your color identity. Next up is Eager Glyph Mage. It's 3 and a white for a 3/3 Cat Cleric. When this creature enters, create a 1/1 white and black Inkling creature token with flying. Now, this type of card has historically been very good in Limited. There have been many examples of 4 mana 3/3s that come with a 1/1 buddy, but this is the first one that has a 1/1 buddy that has flying, which is absolutely a game changer because flying is one of the best mechanics in Limited. The 1/1 becomes so much better as an attacker because of that evasive ability, because a ground 1/1 on turn 4 is very rarely going to be able to chip in for damage, but a flying 1/1 is oftentimes going to be able to do maybe 2 or 3 damage over the course of the game, depending on the matchup. Getting 2 bodies is really good for defensive reasons. If you play this sort of card, all of a sudden you can do like lineups of double blocks. If you have like random 2/2s lying around, you can still throw 3/3 and 2/2 into a block, 2/2 and 1/1 into blocks. You can just like, you have a lot of flexibility. If your opponent has any 1 toughness creatures, the 1/1 lines up really well against those. This is a really good version of this effect, and it's often the sort of effect that gets underrated, especially because this doesn't necessarily scream synergy power level. It's not like, oh, this clearly synergizes with what the black-white decks are doing. This clearly synergizes with what the red-white decks are doing. This is just a good card, and as such, especially in Sealed, cards that are just like generically good tend to get a little bit better, and this card is a very good version of this effect and one you shouldn't be sleeping on. Next up is Terrafractal, which is X green-blue for a 1/0 dinosaur fractal. Don't worry, it's going to have some stats. It's got flying, and this creature enters with X +1/+1 counters on it. When this creature enters, you gain 2 life. So the really cool thing about this card is the modality. Obviously, you can't just cast it for 2 mana, but if X equals 1, you get a 2/1 flyer that gains you 2 life. Now, historically, you generally pay like 1 extra mana to give a creature flying, and these days, you generally pay 1 extra mana and the flyer will have some ability. So, like a 3 mana 2/2 flyer with a little bit of upside tends to be kind of like the zone like that you're kind of looking for at a very baseline. A 4 mana 3/3 flyer, a 5 mana 4/4 flyer has historically been a pretty good card, and generally, once you get even bigger than that, like a 6 mana 5/4 flyer, like having high-powered flying creatures like big flyers is especially scary because they don't make as many of those. So the fact that this has the scalability, the power is much more important with flyers than the toughness. So like the difference between a 2/1 flyer and a 2/2 flyer isn't as big as the difference between a 2/2 flyer and a 1/2 flyer, because flyers tend to be aggressive cards. You want to attack with your flyer, and so the power matters a lot more, because oftentimes they're attacking relatively uncontested. So a 2/1 flyer, much more similar to a 2/2 flyer than a 1/2 flyer would be, because that power is much more essential, because you want to be attacking with them, not blocking with them. And so when you have a card like Terrafractal, it gives you this flexibility in your curve where in the late game, playing like a 6 mana 5/4 flyer that gains you 2 life is going to be really good, because you just, the 2 life helps you get into these situations where it is favorable to start racing, because that life gain can help offset the fact that you are playing a card that inherently has a little bit lower of a stat line, because flyers tend not to be the sort of card, like they're good in aggressive decks because you want to be attacking, but if you're blocking with them, flying is irrelevant unless you're blocking another flyer. And so they tend to be cards that make you want to attack, get into racing situations, and gaining that 2 life can be all of the difference in that scenario. And the fact that you can play this at any point in your curve, it's going to be relatively comparable to a flyer that you want, and the 2 life is going to make it like a nice little boost, because that's the sort of incremental bonus that I was talking about. Like a 3 mana 2/2 flyer that gains you 2 life would be a reasonable card, I think. And a lot of the times, if you have like the Terrafractal, you're going to be able to put it at a curve, point in your curve where you're really happy. You're going to get to spend all of your mana for the turn, which is going to be really useful. And in the extreme late game, you can just get like an insane card. It's a great top deck. And if you have any ramp, things like that, Terrafractal just fits really nicely into the green-blue deck. And there are even some cards in green-blue that care about casting X spells or having X spells, and so that can be nice for that synergy as well. Now, before I get to more of the commons, I do want to mention that this coming Sunday, April 12th, I am going to be running a group coaching session to help you get ready for the Secrets of Strixhaven pre-release. I'm going to be talking about more cards that get better specifically in pre-releases. I'm going to be talking about which Strixhaven college you should be picking, some pros and cons of each of them. We're going to be going through like a build together so you can understand like the best process for building your deck. Lots of time for answering questions, general sealed tips, things like that. So if you're interested, you can find the link to sign up in the description down below. Hope to see you there. Now, the next card I want to talk about is Spirit Mascot. It's red-white for a 2/2 Spirit Ox. Whenever one or more cards leave your graveyard, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. Now, 2 mana 2/2, it's hard to go that far wrong. Now, the thing, we already talked about the 3 mana 2/3 Trampler that could grow over the course of the game. The 3-drop slot tends to be a lot more contested, so if you don't have a reasonable expectation of growing that card at least a couple of times, that card's not going to be generally as good. Spirit Mascot, on the other hand, comes down on turn 2, which is a point in the curve that's very essential. You'll generally play this even if you only have like a couple of ways to grow it. And in sealed, it's kind of nice because you can like have a 2-drop that can potentially become a 3/3 or a 4/4 in the late game if the game does stall out. There are going to be synergy pieces in red-white that give you a pretty good chance of getting this to grow, and as a result, this is going to be a pretty nice card. In draft, you can definitely build around this. It's the sort of card where it's like, okay, how can I get cards to leave the graveyard? And then you'll kind of just start seeing, like, every time you like look at the cards, like, okay, there's more ways to get things to leave my graveyard than I think. There's flashback spells, there's cards that just return things from your graveyard back to your hand, or they exile cards from your graveyard for some effect. There's plenty of ways to trigger this card, and Spirit Mascot is the sort of card that if you are trying to play a red-white deck, this can be a really nice way to pressure your opponents. Red-white, even though it does kind of have more grindy elements, still generally wants to be assertive, because if you're playing against like a blue-green deck, you're oftentimes going to go up against these like giant flyers that we just looked at, or like these late game X spells or things of that nature. So you, I think, still do want to lean assertive with your red-white decks, but Spirit Mascot really helps you do that, because while you're doing kind of your nickel and dime stuff, you have a 2-drop that's a growing threat. 2-drops that work with your synergy are really, really good. Next up is Heated Argument. It's 4 and a red for an instant. Heated Argument deals 6 damage to target creature. You may exile a card from your graveyard. If you do, Heated Argument also deals 2 damage to that creature's controller. Now, this is a perfect example of a card that works with the 2-drop we just looked at. It's a way to exile a card from your graveyard. If you do this at instant speed, you can like grow your creature, maybe win a combat. But generally, you're not going to do that because you want to kill a big creature and your guy would just get blocked by that creature, so you miss out on some damage. But still, a nice way to kill an opponent's creature, deal some extra damage to that opponent, and trigger your synergy cards. It's a really kind of cool thing when you see these cards and you're like, well, if this was in a different format, it would be a reasonable card. We've seen this sort of effect before. There was a card back in Throne of Eldraine that if you cast it and use like 3 red in the mana cost, you could like deal, I think, 3 damage to your opponent. I don't remember the exact details. That's not important. But we have seen these kind of expensive removal spells that deal some damage to your opponent, and those can be really useful as ways to pressure your opponent, get them into lower life total ranges, so that you can actually, like, if the board stalls out, know, okay, all I have to do is get my opponent to 2 life, and then if I ever top deck Heated Argument, I'm going to win the game. Or maybe you have a couple of this sort of effect, and then all of a sudden it's like, okay, if I get my opponent to 4 life over the course of the game, maybe I'll draw a couple of these and be able to sneak out a win. This sort of extra reach when your opponent has potentially stabilized is really nice. And incidental damage is also important in a format where there's incidental life gain. So if you're playing against the black-green deck that plays the 2-drop that gains life, having just a couple extra points of damage here and there can mean that your creature curve is that much more effective at dealing damage. And this thing works not only well with cards that care about exiling things from the graveyard, pressuring your opponent, but also works well with cards that care about casting instants and sorceries that cost 5 mana or more for the Opus mechanic. A card like Expressive Fire Dancer, another common that can get much better if you build around and kind of understand what you're trying to do. It's a 2-mana 2/2. So again, this 2-mana 2/2 stat line is just kind of like the default for your creatures. If you see like a 2-mana 1/2, it needs to have a good ability because a lot of the time it's going to be facing off against 2-mana 2/2s. It has Opus. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, this creature gets +1/+1 until end of turn. If 5 or more mana was spent to cast that spell, this creature also gains double strike until end of turn. So if you cast an instant speed 5-mana spell or a sorcery, but generally the instants are going to be more scary, you turn your 2/2 creature into a 3/3 double striker, which is the sort of thing that you would generally spend like maybe 4 mana to get. I mean, sometimes even more. I mean, double strike just makes the creature like twice as powerful. It not only can make it eat things in combat. If this gets blocked by a 3/3 and you give it double strike all of a sudden, it's like, okay, well, that's absolutely terrifying. But it also gives you this kind of like, I don't know, like the fact that it just turns your creature into a much more powerful threat. And it makes it really hard for your opponent to block in combat if you've built your deck correctly. So if you attack your Expressive Fire Dancer into your opponent's 3/3 when you have 5 mana available, what are they supposed to do? If they block and you have a 5-mana spell, it's absolutely devastating because the double strike means your creature is going to just eat their creature. But if they don't block and you have the 5-mana thing, then they're going to take an extra 4 damage because it gets +1/+1 and double strike. What if you have nothing? If you just attack into your creature, they don't block, you just play another creature post-combat, your Expressive Fire Dancer was able to chip in for some damage. This is going to be a very skill-testing card and one of those ones where if your opponent is tapped out and has the choice of whether to block Expressive Fire Dancer when you have 5 mana available, if you've built your deck correctly, you should be able to make this really tricky on your opponent, be able to just like attack them with your creature. Sometimes you might even want to bluff attack because if your opponent has a really important like creature, they might not want to block the Fire Dancer because even like a 6/6 creature is going to trade with the Expressive Fire Dancer if you are able to trigger that Opus. So building around your cards, properly enabling them. I mean, the difference between this card in a deck that can enable it and a deck that can't enable it, it's absolutely massive. Sure, giving a creature +1/+1 every once in a while still makes this a nice card. It can still attack in past 3 drops and things like that. But it's really scary if you can use this. And you can, of course, use this on defense as well. If you have Expressive Fire Dancer, just like holding it up on blocks, and then you cast an instant spell on your opponent's turn, then it's also going to get that +1/+1 and double strike, and it becomes a really scary blocker. And so this is just a really nice card and one that's easy to kind of think, okay, it's a 2-mana 2/2 with a little upside. It can actually really be a scary card. Next up is in a 5-mana instant that plays really well with that. It's a card that you can hold up on your opponent's turn. They aren't necessarily going to know how to respond. 5 mana, 4 and a blue, Muse's Encouragement. It's an instant. Create a 3/3 blue and red elemental creature token with flying, Surveil 2. Now, the thing to understand about flying, we've already talked about it, is like generally a 3/3 flyer for 5 would be a bit small. Now, 3/3 flyer with flash is a thing we've seen in the past. It's been like a filler level card. Cards have gotten a lot better since then. So a 3/3 flyer with flash isn't really something you're that interested in these days. But having this be an instant instead of just a creature is really important for those cards that care about Opus. If you have a card that has like the Opus cards, having cards that are going to be able to, like, you can fill your deck and have like maybe 4 or 5 instants that can potentially trigger it are going to be really nice because it just puts your opponent in a bind when you can just have these like powerful synergy pieces. And Surveil 2 is absolutely huge. By the time you get to the late stages of the game, Surveil 2 is almost equivalent of saying draw a card because any lands that you are able to surveil away is basically like drawing you a card because you don't need the lands at that stage of the game. So the reason Surveil 2 is almost as good as drawing a card sometimes is because if there's 2 lands on your deck, you would rather Surveil 2 a lot of the time than draw a card because you don't care about those extra lands. So if you surveil away 1 land, it's kind of like, okay, that's reasonable. If you surveil away 2 lands, it's a huge win. And if you surveil away no lands, then like, sure, you're drawing 2 good cards, so you're probably in decent shape anyway. So Muse's Encouragement is a really nice card, really good synergy piece, and the sort of thing that you're going to be looking for in your decks when you have those Opus cards. It also can just be like a fine top-end card, though it does, I think, get significantly better if you have those cards that reward you for casting Muse's Encouragement in addition to the benefit you get from just casting Muse's Encouragement. And so this format seems like it's going to have a lot of tricky shenanigans lined up. If your opponent holds up a lot of mana, there are going to be ways for them to affect the board state at instant speed and for them to trigger their cards and get their synergies rolling. So there's going to be a lot of unexpected things, and understanding what your opponent can have available is really important because if your opponent has nothing in play and has 5 mana available and you have a couple of 2/2 creatures, knowing that Muse's Encouragement is a card should impact whether or not you decide to attack, because if you think they have this, You don't really want to suicide in your creatures if they're going to flash in, Amuse's Encouragement, and really punish you. It's a decision that you have to make, and this card is a really important one to be aware of in the format, and also an important one to know how to use if you're trying to be playing like these cards that care about Opus, or just playing these late game decks in general, where a 3/3 flyer that surveils 2 at instant speed can actually be a pretty reasonable threat. Anyway, that's going to do it for this video. Hopefully understanding the commons has given you a lot more context and gives you a good understanding. That's going to do it for this one, though. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll talk to you next time.